Hey everyone, this is Dr. L. Um, I hope all of you are doing okay. Um, I figured that since we can no longer meet for the rest of the term, I thought I would put some um, content on using YouTube, just some lectures, try to go through some of the material here, shorter lectures, and put them on there for you to have as a resource. I hope it helps. Um, if you have questions, you can always use the comment section, or email, whatever you need to do. I guess one quick announcement: make sure that you keep working on those papers. I'm not going to change the due date for the paper, so make sure you work on that term paper. Keep in contact with me if you have any questions about that, and be sure to log into the site and do whatever activities that I have for you. Okay, so chapter 8. This is about perceiving motion. All right, so one of the themes that we still see that was introduced earlier, like let's say chapters 3, 4, actually all the way back to the first chapter, really, is this notion of modularity. So we're going to see there's different parts of the brain that are involved with different types of motion perception, which is, I wanted to make sure you're aware of that. Um, Motion is very important for us. It's very, in terms of it's obviously it's of practical importance. It allows us to survive. So if you think about the predator versus prey, um, a predator uses movement to detect the prey. So if the prey moves, so you can imagine the wolf chasing the rabbit or whatever, the rabbit, when it's being chased by the wolf, it's in its best interest to stay very still, to stay as still as possible. And motion, though, can serve to capture the attention of that moving object. So if the prey remains motionless, it's less likely to be noticed. All right, so here you can see, I'm going to get out of this for a second as I do these things. By the way, these are not meant to be completely formal here. I'm putting them together. I'm doing this out of my house. So if you hear any noises, hear my kids or whatever, I do apologize, but that's just we're all trying to do what we can, right? Um, Let me see here. Going into the course again. Here you can see, this is on the materials. I tried to make these available for you. Let me know if you can see these or not. But this is if you go into the digital text and the digital supplements, this is in chapter 8, the exploration files. And now here you can see, excuse me, here you can see a bunch of lines, right? And without movement, there's nothing there. You don't see the form. But as soon as we hit this, wow, there you go. It's magic, right? There's this bird flying around. Um, and then I stop it. Wow, the bird disappears. It's really cool. And so you can see that's attentional capture. We're seeing movement and almost form from movement. Without the movement, you don't know that that's a bird. So that's very cool. And that demonstrates the point they're trying to make there. So let's, okay. Anyway, kind of moving along, and here you can see some other examples. Like there's a creature right there that looks very much like a leaf, and as soon as that thing moves, it's a dead giveaway. So that's just giving you some ideas there. Couple of things. Real motion versus illusory. All right, so you have actual motion, which means that there's something in the universe around you, excuse me, is actually moving. Versus something illusory. Remember, illusory just means fake, whatnot, or we sometimes call this apparent movement. Stationary stimuli are presented in slightly different locations. Um, this is the basis of movement in movies and TV. Once again, I've said this before, that when you're watching a movie, you're watching a series of still frames being presented sequentially. At, let's say 24 frames a second. But each frame is a still image. It's just presented, quickly. Um, right? And that's also the basis for things like, video games. And that's why I put this link in there for you. I'll get rid of that. But here you can see Pong, right? Here's Pong. Pong is an old arcade game. I found a link where I swear YouTube has just about everything now. It's a game back in 1972. You can see that. A long time ago, one of the original video games. And if we play it, let's let this load up, shall we? This is induced. This is fake motion. we're seeing, strictly speaking, just the activation and deactivation of pixels from one time to the next. Um, Strictly speaking, nothing is really moving on here, right? It's just say it's kind of like the movies. You're not really. It's a trick essentially, and it's a product of the mind, really. At least that's how I look at it. So there you go. Maybe y'all can start playing Pong. Um, but yes, um, and this is the basis for for movies, for whatever you're thinking of, movies or television or whatnot. We're seeing sequential, that as this little dot moves, pixels are being activated and deactivated, but we interpret that as motion, which is sort of interesting. But anyway, trying to get there. There's other stuff there. There's Space Invaders, huh, other things, whatever. Okay. Um, oh, by the way, I'm not going to go through every single slide in these chapters. I'm just trying to go over some of the major ones. Um, and like once again, if you have questions on, you can leave them in the comments section or whatnot. Here we see apparent motion again. Like here's the scrolling marquee. That's a beautiful example of um, these signs like the scrolling marquee are simply lights being flashing on and off in different locations. And but it looks, and this goes along with the theme again that I was telling you that motion the perception is a subjective experience. We're not, if our brains, if our perceptual systems were different, we might very well not perceive that as moving. It might, so you can imagine if we encountered an alien or something, I'm just, whatever, that they might experience something vastly different than we do, you know. That's why I keep saying it's a subjective experience. There's some other interesting phenomena. This is a motion after effect. You stare at, I could not find one online, but here, if you stare at a waterfall, for example, and then look to the right or left or whatever, you would see the opposite motion. That's a motion after effect. That's kind of interesting. That reveals a little bit about the possible cortical mechanisms. It's kind of like a after image we get with colors. Like if you stare at something red for a long time, you might see a green after image and vice versa. And it kind of reveals possibly how motion detection circuits work. So if you have, let's say, a downward motion circuit is being activated and it gets saturated, then you look away, there's like an inhibitory process that might cause you to perceive upward motion. At least that's the idea, and whatnot. Okay. With this experiment, looking here, the Larson experiment, they tried to see if the brain has separate areas that process actual versus apparent versus real motion. Um, Now they're arguing in their stimulus that this dot is truly almost like an analog system. It's truly moving back and forth, versus dots are flash, so they appear to move. All right. Um, so that's one. Okay, so I guess we can assume that. Um, but we'll just make the assumption that their stimuli is pretty good. But basically, they found, and they're looking at the cortex here. This was humans, by the way. They were in using an fMRI machine. That they basically found that in the real versus apparent motion condition, the same parts of the brain are being activated. So that might be why we experience the same thing, because it's almost like the brain is essentially fooled, or it lacks the cortical mechanisms to distinguish between the two in a meaningful way. So as long as those parts are activated, you're going to think the thing is moving, whether it really is moving or it's more of an apparent motion. At least that's the idea. That would explain why the scrolling marquee actually works in terms of, or tricks us into, to the motion, to believing motion is actually there. Excuse me. Um, okay, let's see here. Now, some other things to consider, and I wanted to kind of go through, some of this information here about what we're trying to explain. One point I want to make here, and you can go through the details here. Obviously, it's in the book and whatnot, but our perception of motion relies on more than just the image on the retina. And I'm gonna make this point again when we go through depth. But the image on the retina is not sufficient to explain perception of motion. and because we can have different types of conditions, and you can see that those are the figures here, but kind of jumping ahead to this. If I'm looking, let's say, straight ahead as an object moves past me, let's just say, the object is moving, the eyes are stationary, the image on the retina moves, so we perceive that the object is moving. So that kind of makes sense, right? It so one possible theory as to how we detect motion is, well, if the images are moving on the retina, then there you go, there's your motion perception. But there's a problem with that. Um, what if I fixate on the object? I look around, or let's say in this case, or I'm looking around the room, objects are stationary, or excuse me, no, sorry. Excuse me, yes, I'm tracking an object. I follow a moving object with my eyes. Eyes are moving, object is moving, but the image on the retina is stationary. So it can't just be a matter of stationary versus not stationary. There has to be some sort of correction, there has to be a comparative mechanism in place, right? That takes into account motor commands to the eyes, takes into account head movements, all kinds of stuff in order so that we can accurately know what's moving, excuse me, and what is not moving. And one of those things, one theory that's used to explain that is called the corollary discharge theory. And here you can see the basics, the theory here. That when, and this is more of a cognitive type of theory where we have these hypothetical constructs here of this image displacement signal, a motor command, and this copy that's sent off in the motor command, which is called the corollary discharge. So the idea is that there has to be some part of the brain that maybe compares signals, that takes into account, okay, the image moving, but also whether or not the eyes are receiving motor commands. And that's what they're trying to get into here. So according to this particular theory, movement is perceived when this comparator, by the way, this comparator is a hypothetical cognitive structure. When it receives input from both the image displacement signal and the corollary discharge signal, and it's not perceived when the corollary and the image displacement arrive at the same time. So this is more like if it gets a corollary discharge or it gets an image displacement at different times, then we will infer motion. If they're arriving at the same time, then we do not perceive motion. Or at least that's the theory. So here you can see an example of this. Here we have this gentleman walking past this person. There's their eyeball. Image is moving across the retina. Okay, so the eye is stationary, image is moving. So the image displacement signal is being sent off, and you're going to perceive motion. Here, though, and here you're going to perceive motion, and then they explain that here. So let's say eye is stationary, stimulus is moving. So image displacement signal. So the person's walking across. Okay, I think that I perceive motion. We're also, according to this theory, we're going to perceive motion if I track something. So if I'm tracking this person, if I was tracking this little mouse here, if I was tracking that, then I would be creating a corollary discharge signal, because as the motor command is being sent to the eyeball, a corresponding corollary discharge, another signal, is being sent to the comparator, and then I perceive motion. Okay, but if I'm moving my eyes, as I go, let's say I go about my room in here, my bedroom or whatever, and I'm looking about, nothing is moving, right? I have an image displacement because images are being displaced, but I'm also accounting for the fact that my eyes are moving. So I won't perceive motion. And that's what they're saying here. Okay, in this case, that's what they're trying to account for. In other words, you have this image displacement occurring. So as I'm looking about my room, okay, the TV, the computer, whatever, I look back and forth, it's not moving, right? And we perceive that it's not moving because we have a corollary discharge signal that's being created essentially because I'm making my eyes move. All right, if that sort of makes sense. So once again, it's a clever theory. It's a relatively straightforward theory to explain why, if I'm moving my eyeballs around, I don't think that everything in the room is all of a sudden moving. All right, and it gives you at least a little introduction to things. Okay, kind of moving along here. What about some of the neural mechanisms of motion perception in the brain? Make sure you study motion perception here, the Newsom and Perry research. The middle temporal area appears to be important. There's other parts of the brain that are important for motion, different aspects of the motion. But as we go from, and these are what we call the extrastriate areas. These are areas out in the cortex that we're starting to see, more and more specialization in the brain in terms of function. Um, and Newsom and Perry did some work on this, and they used monkeys to, so they can go and actually stimulate this part of the temporal lobe that they speculated that that they were informed of as believing as an area that's important for motion perception. Um, and what they found, to kind of make a long story short here, is they trained monkeys to do this to judge the movement of these dots, which are shown here. All right. And these dots could all, and the monkeys would look at a screen, and basically, if they got the answer correct, they would get food. Because that's why they would do the task. Um, So here you can see if there's a 50% correlation, that means half the dots in this case are moving upward. The remaining dots are all moving randomly. They're not moving in accordance with each other. 100% would be they're all moving in the same direction. And they would train them on this task. And they found that they thought, well, what would happen if we stimulated the medial temporal lobe? And what they found basically was if they stimulated it, monkeys got better at it. It actually enhanced performance after a while. But if they went in and destroyed it, there was a deficit. So after recovering from the damage, they went from, being able to do it with as little as 1 or 2% correlation, means they're really sensitive to the motion, versus after damage, they still could do it. So that tells us that MT is not the only areas involved with this, but they needed more. They had to recover. All right. So this is just giving you an idea of how neurophysiologists kind of study the role that certain parts of the brain play, in this case, motion perception or whatnot. And so this is sort of interesting. So you can see her results show that as coherence of dots movement increased, so did the firing of the MT and the judgment of movement accuracy. So they found that as they got better at this task, we saw a correlation in the way those neurons worked. Newsom and Perry also, I believe they did say this, or at least maybe some scientists afterwards argued that this part of the brain, they thought, actually plays a role in the true perception of certain types of motion. I'm mentioning this because it's speculated by neuroscientists that when V1, earlier parts of the brain or parts of the thalamus, and things like that, earlier in the visual system, when they're active, it's not necessarily associated with conscious activity yet. It's only after we start getting to these more advanced cortical areas that those areas we think, or at least it's been proposed, are actually active and directly associated with the actual perception or the conscious awareness, in this case, of actual movement, if that makes sense. At least that makes sense. I mean, at least I'm trying to make it make sense a little bit. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Going through, I don't want to have to do all of this. I want to just give you some of this stuff here. Once again, make sure you look at all of this in your book. What I do want to point out here also about the importance of motion perception, it can be used to identify objects, right? And you saw earlier that motion helped identify that little bird in the image there. There's also something called biological motion, okay, right? And these are the point light Walker stimuli. And it turns out that males and females, for example, have characteristic ways of walking. And if I see, I can't see anything but the dots, and these dots are placed like in the joints and such. And when they start to move, most people can say, oh, that looks like it might be a woman or it might be a man. And I'll put a link to some biological motion. If you go on YouTube and just do a search for this, you'll see the examples or point light Walker stimuli. You'll see that. And it turns out that there's a part of the brain that tends to show more activity to this type of motion versus maybe the motion you see when you're looking at like the Pong game. All right, so it gets rather specialized. And this is summarized nicely here. So we've got V1, good old V1 that we've already spent some time on. Detection of motion across small receptive fields, and that was the Hubel and Wiesel work. You can see like lines going by. The MT area, which I was just talking about, direction of motion, like watching a car go past you to the right or to the left. And also, I didn't mention this earlier, but also it's involved with, kind of estimating the speed of an object. Is it going fast? Is it going slow? There's another connected area to MT called the MST, um, processing of optic flow. So as we drive through, and you see that as you're driving and the let's say the rain is flying by you, or you can see things going past you, or whatever, that's called the optic flow. The medial superior temporal area is involved with, detecting objects that are coming towards you or coming away from you. There's also the superior temporal sulcus, and this is more related to biological motion. All right, so perception of motion related to animals and people. Yeah, you can use point light Walker stimuli. You might be able to say, "Oh, that looks like a cat," or "That looks like a dog." So motion is used not just for locating things, but it can also be used to identify things. And it tells us that these areas, these motion areas and areas that are involved more with the form and identification, they're integrated to a certain extent. And this is, part of what the author, your author Goldstein talks about sometimes, the binding problem in perception. How is it that we have all of these different parts of the brain that appear to have relatively specific functions, but it's all glued together somehow? It's all kind of glued together, so we have this coherent perception, and it's one of the big mysteries. Okay, things like that. Okay, I went kind of quick. Um, I just wanted to kind of go through some of this. I didn't go through all of these things, but I wanted to hit the major topics. Please, if you have any questions, concerns, do not hesitate to email me. And I hope all of you are doing well. And I will post some. I will try to post one of these for each of the remaining chapters for you. Once again, they're fair. I apologize if they're kind of crude, and I'm also not the greatest at this YouTube thing yet. I've had to sort of learn more recently. I've never really. These are some. I'm not, by any means do this as So I'm just. So try to bear with me if it's a little crude, but please let me know if you need anything, and that's it. So take care.